And welcome everybody to How to Start a Company with Your Academic Advisor. We are short one advisor, but we are nevertheless going to move forward as they get onto this call and overcome their technical difficulties. So without further ado, I just want to thank everybody for attending, briefly introduce myself, and kind of go over what we're trying to do with this panel. My name is Michael. I'm Executive Vice President of Strategy for Nucleate, and I'm here with Oliver, the co-president of Nucleate, and together we're trying to empower the next generation of biotech leaders. And in one capacity of doing that is our Activator program, which supports the next generation of biotech talent and academic trainees and their advisors in starting companies that could change the world with biotechnology. So of course, bench scientists are often best able to see the potential of their inventions. And pioneering biotech companies based on these inventions are, of course, founded by the students and their advisors. But how exactly do you start a company with your PI? This is a critical question, and one that everyone has to often face if they're going to start that company. It's quite daunting. So we're incredibly thrilled to be joined by George Church and Mark Bathe, and their students turned founders and alumni of the Activator program, including Gleb and Floris and Tim, who'll be joining us shortly. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists as we get started in trying to address this question. How do you start a company with your advisor? And we'll start with just general introductions to that question. I'm going to go just kind of across clockwise, starting with Mark, unless Oliver wants to hop in with a quick note.
Oh, I was just going to say hello, everyone. We're working on getting the rest of our panelists here, and we're going to start with the introductions, and hopefully by the end of it, everyone will have joined. As Michael mentioned, my name's Oliver. I'm one of the co-presidents and co-founders of Nucleate, and just extremely privileged to be here with everyone, sharing an hour and a half for this very exciting and hopefully informative discussion. As we go around and do the introductions, I would ask that you maybe start by just giving sort of a quick introduction about, what your company or your lab sort of does and focuses on, and then from there maybe say a little bit about yourself and why you're excited to be here tonight.
All right, so I'm leading off. Thanks so much, Michael and Oliver, for the opportunity to be on the panel tonight. So my name is Mark Bathe. I'm on the faculty at MIT. I'm also a co-founder of two companies that actually came out of Nucleate. Kano Therapeutics with Floris Engelhardt, who's here, and also Cache DNA, where James Banal went through the program. So I'm a huge fan of Nucleate. It's certainly nucleated these two entities from my lab, and really lowered the activation barrier associated with getting our exciting technology out of the lab. So really happy to be here.
Okay, awesome. And we are so thrilled that you're here as well. And as well thrilled that George just joined us. So for some context, we are going around and doing introductions on imminently pertaining to this topic of how to start a company with your academic advisor. For now, we're just starting with a bit of introduction on who are you and what does your lab do and focus on broadly, and then, or your company. And then why you're so excited to be here tonight talking about that very topic. So next in line will be Floris.
Hey, hi everyone. My name is Floris Engelhardt, co-founder and CEO of Kano Therapeutics. We, in really simple words, we make replacement parts for the human genome, thinking that if we want to move forward with CRISPR-based therapeutics, saying we want to replace not only single letters in the genetic code, but whole sentences, we need synthetic DNA to do so. And we make long single-stranded DNA molecules with our fermentation-based technology to do so, adding that into a platform that allows us to create a feedback loop that makes it more than just a raw material, but an actual therapeutic agent. And I'm excited to be here because I actually met my co-founder through Nucleate, who back then was an MBA Sloan student and is now our CBO, COO, HR, payroll, whatever, anything he can do. Really a very important part of the company.
Amazing. And then do we want to move over to George?
Yeah, hi, I'm George Church, professor at Harvard and MIT, technology developer. I've co-founded about 46 companies and worked with many of the people on this call, one way or another. My being seems to be decaying right now. It's very interesting. That's a nice effect. I guess more will come out in the discussion.
Apologies for that. I think we're just gonna.
It's your glow.
No, I like it.
It's your aura and your glow.
Yeah, it agrees with my new touring self, you know.
Awesome. Thank you, George. And then Gleb.
Hey everyone, my name is Gleb Kuznetsov, a co-founder and CEO of Manifold Bio. We are a protein therapeutics company, and what we do is bring measurement and design of all kinds to the way that protein therapeutics are made. We have a really interesting protein multiplexing capability, which actually lets us do multiplexed in vivo experiments. So we like to describe what we do as in vivo biologics design. Founded the company with George after doing my PhD with him, and excited to be here. We were in the first cohort of Nucleate back when it was called Activate, and really exciting to be here and share some of the lessons that we've learned around that time and since then.
All right, fantastic. And hopefully Tim will be joining us too as well very soon. George, I'm working on restoring your person as quickly as I can.
That's okay. I like it. It's good. Yeah.
But in the meantime, I wanted to start with this question, which actually comes from sort of the very broad audience of this dark place that we call Twitter. And a few weeks ago, I tweeted out that we were going to be doing this panel, which got a great reception. And one of the questions that was asked is, there is often misalignment between the PI, the tech transfer office and licensing office, and the student on what should be the student's role. What should it be in the venture when the student, but not the PI, is coming on full time? So what is the most effective way to navigate the set of conversations that question will spawn? And why don't we start with Floris?
I think the first set of questions is a journey for the student themselves. It's like, who do I want to be? I mean, that's the most important question of all. Who do I want to be? What do I want to achieve? Because there are like certainly very many different roles that you can do. You could come on and say, like Gleb and I, just like we want to be a CEO, which is very outside facing, but not much technology involvement over time. I want to be a CTO because I really want to build up the lab. Or there is the third option. If you say you come on full time, but you don't want to have a C-suite role, there are certainly many different like other potential opportunities that you can have huge impact in the company, but just not like actually do the management. And that is where you start. And then from that, you start the conversation with your professor.
Yeah, I also just want to point out, first of all, great response, Floris. I think it is really important to know whenever you undertake something, this big, right? I mean, you work at a startup. If you're really committed to it, it's going to be 5 to 10 years of your life, right? I think it is really important to start with, what you want to do, and also just want to point out that we've had Arman Sharif from Squeeze come and give a few talks across various Nucleate events over the past few years, and he also always starts there and says, a lot of people want to be the CEO, and that's great. But if you don't want to be the CEO or it isn't right for you, that's also, not a problem, right? Like there's a lot of really impactful science you can do and across many different sort of roles and levels within the organization. So great answer.
Absolutely. So then from here, let's go to Floris's advisor, Mark.
Yeah, well, Floris gave a great answer. I think that I think that starting a company, from what I've learned in just the brief time of starting 2 companies, is certainly a process. So it's something that takes time, and I think that's really important to appreciate, because it's a journey that develops over time, and a conversation as much as sort of an endpoint or a starting point per se. And I think, as Floris, nicely said, I think that it's really important, when you're going into initiating the conversation of the company you want to start, and how it should be founded, and how it should look, that you're clear on, how you want to have that conversation. What are sort of, things that you certainly want to have, for example, a CEO title, and what are some other things that you might be more flexible on. So sort of, what are the rails or the guide rails on how you want the startup to look for you as a faculty member, and of course as a founder, student, or postdoc. And then I think it's a fun process to go through a series of conversations together to see how to make that happen, respecting each other's kind of guide rails. And it's the beginning of a long journey of working together too. So it's really important, because you want to, of course, have a great working relationship with your fellow co-founders. So yeah, have fun with it, set up the expectations and kind of guide rails, and then launch the conversation.
So in the spirit of having fun with it, I want to dig into this a little bit, and let's do like a case study here. So this process of determining almost who you are, it's a very introspective process. You're reflecting on what you want in life, in a sense. So glad, you started Manifold with George, and how did that introspection happen, and how did that play into the conversations in a practical sense on how you did launch Manifold together with George?
So it's a good question, how to match what you want to have in life as with the mission or the purpose of the company. For me personally, I've always really loved the process of building teams and working on hard problems. I look back at my grad school application, and I basically wrote, in the part at the bottom where it says what you want to do after you graduate, I basically wrote, I want to build teams and solve really hard problems at the intersection of biology and compute. So basically that's what we're doing. The nice thing is, when you have, those are the pieces that you need for a company. There's lots of different contexts. For our company, we had a really hard technology to build. We had, a pretty specific vision of how we could do that. And then we got alignment with the tech office, and with George, of course, just because you have myself and Peter Sogden, joined by our other additional co-founder, Shane Lofgren, really driven, motivated co-founders who really wanted to bring this to life. And so the tech office, it was pretty straightforward to say, hey, license us all the materials that we need, everything we've worked on before, the code and everything. We are the best team to realize this. And then just seeing how driven we are by that, they sort of trusted that, okay, we're going to build. They saw us bring in Shane as our co-founder on the business development side. They sort of trusted that we're going to bring in the right investors, the right team members. And so that's sort of just demonstrating, to quote George, George encourages students to be the masters of their own ship. And so, demonstrating that you're doing that you're the best team and group to realize that, kind of speaks for itself and makes everyone feel good about moving forward with however the titles and positions are.
Yeah, and George, could you weigh in on that? You've started, I think, in your words, over 40 companies, and obviously a lot of your own trainees have led that process in a big way. And so again, as I'm continually working to remove this background from your background, can you just kind of give us some perspective on how those conversations have gone over the years and what you've learned?
Well, I think a major transition occurred. That's when I started out as a student. Actually, I worked with one large company, Biogen, and then one large company, Biorad, and one startup, Biogen, and then first one I really helped restart was called Genome Therapeutics back in 89, 90-ish, 95, in that range. And then for a while, it was mostly companies that were where the VC or another faculty would ask me if I wanted to join, and I would kind of join them. And then the major transition occurred when Francois Vignon and Luhan Yang started their companies as postdocs, and suddenly they did well, and all of my postdocs ever since have said, "Oh, I can do that. If they can do that, I can do that." And that was a much better model. I think it worked better. There was more alignment. I'm more aligned with my postdocs than I am with some random investor, and we could communicate well and so forth. So that's really helped. Two of the companies started as graduate students. They started while they were still early in their graduate career. And in one case, that went without a hitch. In the other case, the administration requested that he leave my lab. So actually, he just got his PhD degree, without me, because he wanted me to stay in the company rather than eliminate my conflicts of interest and be his PhD advisor. So they're minor conflicts. I don't think they're really at the level of the company starting so much as the conflict of interest office. And I respect their opinions.
Yes, and that last clause in that sentence is, of course, really important as well. Actually, this is a sort of something interesting about, we've talked a lot about the PI and the student relationship, but what about that third party of the administration, the conflict of interest office, the tech transfer office? How should those bodies or those organizations interact with that relationship between the student and the PI? And what can the student and the PI do to convey the goals of the student, or how should they approach those offices? And maybe, since I just asked this question, I'm going to put Tim on the hot seat and say, you're the first person to answer this question, but also when you do, first introduce yourself. So who are you? What is Wild Microbes? And why are you so excited to be here tonight talking about this?
I think you're muted.
You need to unmute yourself.
There we go. I got it.
Great.
Okay, so Tim Wanye, can you all hear me? All right. I was a postdoc with George, and I came originally from protein engineering out on the west coast of Caltech, out here to microbe engineering with George, which is a big SynBio lab focused on a lot of these genetic tools, and I spent a long time developing genetic engineering methods in microbes, specifically bacteria. A set of tools that build techniques known as MAGE or combineering that let us do very high throughput, very powerful engineering in microbes. And so Wild Microbes is a company that we're building to harness these tools and to build, to make microbes much more engineerable than they are today. So to build high throughput, very powerful genetic engineering tools in novel wild microbes and put them to use in the bioeconomy and in other places. And so, Michael, I believe the question was focused around how we interface with the administration, what the administration and like tech transfer offices and such could do.
Navigating conflict of interest, navigating the tech transfer office and so forth. Exactly.
Yeah. So it's, I think it's, I hear stories about lots of companies and their journeys through tech transfer offices and administrations to moving toward founding companies. And so far, it's been relatively smooth for me. We have a couple patents that we're taking through and hoping to license, but haven't finished the whole process at the moment. But I think it seems like it should be a fairly smooth process. But I think in general, there is some like angst among founders that come out of academic labs as to how much of a equity they'll have to give over, and how much, if they have to pay royalties to a university for the use of the technology that they've developed. I think in different geographies, these can be they can be different levels of concern. So there, I think I think I've heard just anecdotally that in Europe it can be a bit pricier versus the US, and but yeah, definitely tech transfer offices. The relationship can be, by nature, it can be a bit oppositional, where the founder wants to give away as little as possible and the university wants to take as much as possible. And so finding a way to make it less oppositional and more collaborative, I think we definitely, I think there's definitely room to move in that direction.
Yeah, and in the spirit of collaboration and getting aligned, I think one of the key points I want to just touch on, really highlight. I mean, of course, Mark and George, as George was just describing, this kind of trajectory of becoming more aligned with his postdocs and students, and that's fantastic, right? But what kind of feedback would we give to graduate students who aren't, let's say, in the church or the Bathe lab, or maybe not at MIT and maybe in other parts of the country, about why it would make sense to start a company in the first place with your student if you're an advisor, or why, if you're a student, you would consider starting a company with your advisor in the first place? And I'll turn that over to George first.
If you're not at Harvard or MIT, why would a student start a company with an advisor?
Or, you know, I think there may be a perception that, well, if I'm a student and I'm coming from some lab somewhere, why should it be me to start the company? The tech transfer, or maybe other people or venture capital investors are saying the student couldn't possibly start that company. It should be licensed out. It should be something that's partnered with a big pharma company, or they should bring in some outside CEO. Why does it make sense to start that company just fundamentally with your student?
Well, certainly the decision of student or postdoc being in charge versus some licensing. Very often the student or postdoc is more highly motivated, more knowledgeable, just in general, more capable of getting it out into the public where it can do some good. Whether they need to be CEO or not is not quite clear, but the more control they have, probably the more likely that it will stay on track and not go off the rails. So I think that's a personal decision, whether you hire a CEO or whether you become the CEO. But I think it's very important. I've seen again and again the value of having somebody accompany their own technology out into the world and seeing what's wrong with it, what's right about it, and so forth. Very often, if you said the bigger the company you sell it to, license it to, the more likely it's going to sit on some shelf or get turned into something completely pivoted into something completely different.
Do you also see, as a professor in that respect, a sort of material benefit to your lab and the culture and even the type of projects that people undertake because a lot of your students do start companies? Is there like a positive sort of feedback loop that you feel like also impacts positively or negatively the sort of, academic science that's done?
Well, there's definitely a positive feedback loop, whether it's the outcomes are positive for society. I think so. I think at this point, because of our track record, a lot of the people that come to my lab already have a shared vision before they even start drinking the Kool-Aid directly from us, where they see that that's a natural progression. They come in order to be an entrepreneur, and whether it's graduate students or postdocs. I think that's increasingly the case, and as a consequence, they're more competent at it because they're sort of self-selected. And that's been wonderful. I mean, it's nice. It's nice to have the original beacon I had when I was just starting out as a professor, which was the beacon of Harvard and MIT. I didn't have any beacon of my own, really. In fact, I think most people questioned, along with the rest of the world, whether I was insane or not. Most of the ideas in the lab were either useless or or impossible or both. But then after a little while of track record, then people give you a little more rope to hang yourself with.
Totally. And I'd love to also ask Mark's perspective, as someone who's recently started 2 companies with students of yours, what about that process has been maybe surprising or sort of a benefit that you didn't expect, or, how has that sort of shaped your thought process for, how the vision of your lab, in the future may change, or in general, the types of projects that are taken on?
Yeah. I mean, to the first part of the question, I think just to echo what George said, I think by, working with students and postdocs, they by far know and understand the technology best. They also have ownership over the idea and its origins for commercialization, which I think, can really drive their motivation, right? That they're going to be in it for the long game, rather than a third party picking it up and trying to do something with it, but maybe moving on a little more quickly if things don't kind of accelerate and nucleate the way that they were hoping. So I think that's a huge benefit. And then I think, it's also just a much more organic process where, you can start to have those conversations early in the arc of or middle of a PhD or a postdoc. And those conversations, going back to, I guess my original point was, the sort of appreciating and enjoying the process of the company formation and just also defining the company. All of that is a really fun brainstorming process as well. And then I think, both in Floris's case and also James's case, who I mentioned at Cash DNA, through Nucleate, they were able to build a team with, co-founders that came from very different backgrounds, from more of a business background. And I think Floris can speak to that, but I think it becomes even more fun then when you have, a team with someone who has a very different perspective and experience and background to continue that journey of brainstorming and market discovery and product market fit and so forth to build the company. And so kind of, I think, again, working together early with that technical point lead in your lab, and then working through a program like Nucleate to be able to have that person continue on their journey with an incredible ecosystem and a network that then emerges is a fabulous way to start companies. So,
to be very clear to the audience, we're not paying Mark to say these nice things. And Oliver and I are student volunteers. We're both PhD students. For anyone who just joined as well. So since you just called out Floris, I'm also going to call her out and suggest that she give her own perspective on, how early did those discussions begin about company formation around Kano, and how did that kind of change the trajectory of the company?
I think I'm kind of a special case here because basically I did my PhD in Munich, and I remember that I handed in my PhD thesis on a Friday, and on this Sunday I had an email in my inbox from Mark saying, "Hey, remember me from that last conference? I heard you're finishing up your PhD. You want to move to Boston maybe?" So that was like, that sounded interesting. I know that doesn't sound like, hey, you want to build a company, but what ended up happening is that we had our first phone call, and it was like, yeah, I was interested in Boston all my life. I was looking at Boston, but I don't want to become a professor. And so the second sentence was, all right, I don't want you to become a professor. I want you to start a company. So that's how I got hired as a postdoc.
So very early.
Very early. Yeah. But I think the difference in that case was that rolling back, we had published 2 papers back to back on a similar technology. And so it was kind of, we knew from each other. And in that way, it was kind of organic to join forces and look into this together.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? So, it made sense to join forces and there was clear alignment from the very beginning. And try to, I don't know, articulate this counterfactual. How did that change things then in sort of streamlining company formation and also in terms of your research work as a postdoc?
Yeah. So in terms of my research work in general, what speaks to it is that I basically spent 1 year at MIT as a postdoc, not more. And the reason for that was that by joining Mark's lab, I honestly shut the door of becoming like a professor, simply because I went from a like DNA origami lab to a DNA origami lab. So very similar fields. And normally if you want to become a postdoc, you want to switch fields and start something more new. And then in general, like what then happened is that we used the time to immediately look into where is what we call product market fit now in entrepreneurship. Back then I had no idea what it is, but where can we actually, like, you look at our technologies, how can we look at them from a point of view as like, hey, where do they actually apply? And so I directly looked into customer research. I directly worked and talked to pharma companies. And when you say, how did that change the trajectory of the company, then it was really much focused on Mark's lab had, I think he had about 5 to 7 different ideas of what kind of companies he could start. So I think there is much more in the pipeline than we just did with the 2 companies with James and me. And the trajectory of the company was formed by who is the right person, what is the right technology to spin out now.
Fantastic. And so I guess just a note for any students, postdocs, or professors in the audience, that there really are just amazing benefits from getting aligned early about company formation and trying to have that conversation. So maybe we can turn it over to Gleb with Manifold Bio. What about for you in terms of your trajectory of starting Manifold? And maybe let's take a very specific question, which is around on that trajectory, navigating the negotiation of founder equity shares. How does that happen with PIs? And do you think there are any lessons that you can draw from how streamlined that might be in the Church Lab that maybe newcomers to this field of biotech entrepreneurship should draw upon?
I guess George and I and Pierce sat down, each wrote a number on a piece of paper, and then turned them all upside down at the same time. And then they turned out to be the exact, they added up to 100. And so we were done. Which actually isn't too far from the truth. From the Church Lab, we had benefit of other founders coming before us, having started companies. So we can sort of go chat with other folks and understand, how should we think about that question? What's reasonable? What's the precedent? What's the expectations on all fronts? So I think having that kind of conversation, but so for us, it was almost because it was sort of baked into the culture of the folks coming before us. It was a very easy conversation. I think for labs that are maybe newer to this or have not had a company spin out, I think it's just important to really align on the expectations and get educated on what's important. On day one, so there's sort of 3 periods, let's say, simplifying. There's before you start the company, so everything that happened in the lab. There's the sort of the starting of the company in the first short little bit, maybe the first year or 2. And then there's sort of the long term. I think it's important for everyone to align on. So first of all, I think a lot of value needs to happen on parts 2 and 3, what happens in the first couple of years, then what's happening in the long term. Everything that came before that, that respective allocation of ownership happens through, through the licensing office. The inventors of technology will have their respective share as per university standards. But those next parts are really important. And so understanding, is the PI going to be quite heavily involved in the near term, and in the long term, that sort of redefines that equation. And again, I think we were quite well aligned with George about what we expected and what he expected of us. And so it was a straightforward conversation there.
So maybe related to that, and just because it has become so streamlined and so sort of common in the church lab, that's a large distribution, and some of those outcomes have been positive and some of them have been negative. That's the nature of startups and taking risks. So I'm curious, and this is for George, what are the most common mistakes that you see academic founders make, and even mistakes that you've made over the years, that can accidentally kill the company before it even starts, especially pertaining to the relationship of the student and the PI, but maybe also generally?
Yeah, I think one of the main things that, I don't know if it kills the company, but something that makes it less successful and less fun is a poor choice of CEO. One of my companies, which did not involve immediately involved in my postdocs and graduate students, was Gen 9, and we had a good acting CEO from Flagship, but then when he when he wanted to shift out, he was replaced with somebody who had never directed less than 600 employees and had no idea how to keep us on an R&D track long enough. He switched us over immediately to sales, hired a big sales force in a field that really didn't need sales force, and oversold too many products before we were ready. I think he was a good guy and probably expert at big companies, but not appropriate for. Anyway, Gen 9 is now a big part of Ginkgo, and I'm happy to have a relationship to Ginkgo through them and other companies that they've absorbed. But I think that's one thing that happens again and again, is a poor choice of CEO. Another thing is, almost any, when you're very small, whether you're academic lab or a commercial one, your first few employees are very important, probably in addition to the CEO. So if you get a bad apple in there at the beginning, it can make it a toxic environment, or just an environment where you just don't want to come to work. And you really want people to not want to leave, not something that they find. So that's another thing you can do. You can also, start too early or too late. Too late's rarer, but being second or third in the field is not necessarily a bad thing. But being too early, you'll get diluted out multiple times, and the frustration of trying to raise money when you're clearly doing academic research that probably would have been better to get a non-dilutive grant.
Yeah, those are definitely some key ideas, and I think a common theme there was the people are so important in having this kind of environment to really identify the right people. So maybe from here, I want to turn it over to Tim, and I want to ask kind of this question about what transfers over, right, from the experience of being in an academic environment, being a PhD student or a postdoc. And so this will be for all of the academic founders. And so, specifically, what from your academic experience has been most relevant to your work in founding Wild Microbes?
Interesting. Yeah, interesting question. So we're in the process of making our first offers at the moment as a company. So the people element is front and center in our thoughts. And I'd say the Boston ecosystem has been a blessing. There are so many qualified people looking to work at exciting new companies, and so it's really a great space. I think there's great people, all over in different cities around the country and world as well. But it's been really nice to be here, and to carry over from the academic side of thing, how we think about people is, in essence, as a startup, we are opening a lab, and so it's going to function in many respects early on while we're doing that tech development. And I hope we're not too early. And as George mentioned, and we'll have to see how things go. But it is a little. You're going to be doing some research in many cases if you're like deep tech or other like academic spinouts. So I had the fortunate experience of being able to manage some teams while in the lab as a postdoc. So we hired research associates, and we managed projects, which George gave us the freedom to do in his lab, which was very good for our development as managers and leaders in a sense in the laboratory. And so we're looking to essentially replicate that experience and build out a team as we would think about building out an academic lab. It's just that we can hire people with a lot of experience and people that are have already done their postdoc and graduate work. So they're coming in ready to kind of go and fire on all cylinders. So it's been really fun hiring, and I think I'll have maybe 2 or 3 years out, have some insights as to what went right and what went wrong. But from where we are today, it's a really fun time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's definitely about the journey, but also hopefully the destination too. So in the context of the journey, I think Oliver has a very important question to ask everybody on this panel.
Yes. So I'm wondering, how you guys, as both PIs and also academic trainees, can sort of get the most out of, a program like the Activator to really enable sort of the next successful phase of your startup formation. I think we've got a lot of great experiences here, both on the PI side as well as on the founder side. So we'd just be curious to hear a few sort of vignettes about sort of how the Activator was transformative for your sort of startup journey. And maybe we can start with Flores.
All right. So first thing, I didn't predict to find a co-founder during the Activator. I can say that straight out. I started Nucleate with the idea I want to find a co-founder, but I want this person to be a scientist. And then met John, and that was really transformative because John and I just clicked from the first meeting. He was an amazing counterpart to who I am, and I think that is something that is important to find in any co-founder. So what I learned through Nucleate, my biggest outcome after Nucleate was your co-founder doesn't necessarily need to be scientifically the person you're looking for, but it needs to be the person you really want to work with and you enjoy working with. And that will always be what I take with from Nucleate. And then on the other hand, what I think was really important is having this time to being forced. I say forced because of course everyone has other things on their mind and they want to do simply just still have a job to do as postdoc or a PhD student, to sit down and think about the technology and the problem you're addressing differently. And repeating that in the different sessions was very important. And then the third thing, one thing super important in Nucleate, haven't had that anywhere else, was the weekly meetings with our mentors. We had 3 mentors. They were amazing. We had 2 investors and 1 CEO of a startup. One of the investors later came to my birthday barbecue simply because he was so indulged with the experience. He was like, yeah, of course I'm joining. And then the other one became an angel investor. So really took that with me. We still are in contact with them and they're still supporting us whenever we need them.
Love to hear it. And I also I'm really happy that you also pointed out that Nucleate introduced you to your co-founder. And I think one thing, and I want to pivot actually to Gleb next, because he had a slightly different experience, where the person that he was paired with during the program, they did not end up co-founding the company together. And I think one of the things that's really important about the way we've built our program is we do not enforce people to start a company, and we do not enforce that people start companies with the people they're paired with during the program. It's really an educational experience. We do find that about 50% of folks do start a company with the person they're paired with because we do a really good job matching people. But again, just speaking to the strength and the fit of the team, we think it's really important not to force people to work together, but to give them the opportunity to sort of evaluate what that relationship could look like, and then sort of move forward together, on their own terms if it's a good fit. So thank you so much for offering your perspective there, Flores. And I'd love to just pass it over to Gleb now.
Yeah, to that point about the team that you have during Nucleate. So we, actually one hesitation, myself and Pierce Ogden, who was my lab mate, we had of signing up for the program is it felt like, oh, this might be this co-founding event and we are going to have, only a few days or a week to get to know potentially the person that we're going to co-found with, and it's this very high bar where, you know, Pierce and I, we already have each other. We know each other, how we work. But it was really nice because we teamed up with a really nice couple people from the MBA/MD side, Christina Wong and Julia Pian. And it was actually really nice. We sort of from the beginning said, hey, like, you know, here's one thing we were nervous about is we wanted to just take time to get to know people before we formally co-found. And they were totally cool with it. And we sort of aligned, you know, for the purposes of the program, we're going to be co-founders, sort of equal co-founders. We're all going to have sort of designated roles. The folks coming from the MBA side, a little more on the business side, myself and Pierce, a little more on the science side, technology side. And so it turned out really good. We learned a lot together. And then, you know, toward the end, we sort of organically decided, you know, how we were going to proceed going from there. Christina actually started her own company. I think she was on one of your panels recently. So yeah, that's a big thing. And I think going through the reps of things is really good. And actually your sort of Nucleate co-founders, so Christina and Julia in that case, sort of would challenge myself and Pierce to really think about the business that we're thinking about and sort of getting out of the lab and in the sense of just the technology. And then that actually went even bigger. So together we would go out and start talking to people externally, folks in industry, other academics. And that is probably one of the most valuable things you can do as an entrepreneur. Nucleate gives you that infrastructure and motivation, or forces you to do it, as Flores suggested. But I think it's really good for you. You know, whatever, it's good medicine. So you get out there, you get feedback, and you know that's how we do things. Still, we're constantly talking to people, getting feedback, and iterating.
Awesome, thank you for that. And Tim.
Yeah, so I did meet my co-founder through the Nucleate program. His name is Ben Kramer. He's a Stanford from Stanford Graduate School of Business. We met cross country and just hit it off really well on Zoom calls, and we worked remotely for a while. And I know the other teams have had this experience through Nucleate too, where they've paired up cross-coastally and started a company together before even meeting in person. And so it's pretty amazing what can happen now. And yeah, Ben is a great counterpart to me. He's younger, he's really energetic, he's passionate about the same things that I'm passionate about. We both want to make an impact on the world from a sustainability lens. And so we met through the Nucleate Eco program, which is for the I call it like red biotech would be the healthcare. So this is more like the green biotech side of things. And there's a whole lot of people passionate in that side of the biotech landscape too. And so it was great to find somebody really, really invested in starting a company like that with me. And I think that's one of the great things that the program does, is pulls people from the business side that can kind of pair up with scientists looking to execute on that passion too. And so it really kind of makes like a nice founding team in a lot of cases, and it did for me. One other thing I want to mention about Nucleate is that I think one of the things that Ben and I found was really like top notch about the program was that they had great educational programming, but I think far and away the caliber of the advisors that we interacted with week to week was really high. So there were good investors, really good experts from across very relevant industries. They were paired very thoughtfully with us when we were, so I think it was a Wednesday evening weekly session. And I think we would interact with 2 or 3 people most weeks. And they were very thoughtful pairings that made a lot of sense for the business that we wanted to found. And we struck up relationships with a number of different people across industries that we maintain to this day, and we reach out to for advice. And that was extremely valuable for us.
Thank you. Love to hear it. And I will just point out one more time that Tim was participating in the eco track of the Activator, which supports life science companies that are tackling non-human health problems. So, if you're out there and you're in the life sciences and you've got an application that maybe isn't therapeutics or diagnostics, but trends more towards sustainability or even consumer biotech, the eco Activator program may potentially be right for you. I'd love to turn it over to Mark now.
Okay, so I've already I think plugged Nucleate enough. So for my the experience that we've had has just been incredibly enabling. I'd say that going back to Floris's story of her trajectory, for me the most important part of starting the couple companies we have is identifying the people, because you start with one person and then you add a second and a third and a fourth. And, I think as early as the culture of the company, the mission of the company, the resonance of the company with, how you want to impact the world together, all sort of emerges. And it's so important. So, in Floris's case, as she mentioned, she was, just done her PhD in a very similar area to where we had been working and interested in commercializing, and saw room for impact. And fortunately, we were able to get her to cross the pond, and much less in the middle of a pandemic or right around it. So, and she landed here, and it was really, then by meeting John Vroom, and through the program, that the resonance just grew, and couldn't be happier also with John. And but the point is that Floris attracts the types of co-founders and people into the organization that already reflect her. And the same is true for James Spinall, who founded Cash DNA, and that also met Mike Besich, a Harvard MBA, who's also just a fabulous addition to the team. So it's all about the people once you have the technology, of course, and sort of the broad concept. And then there's a snowball effect. It's still early days, of course, for us, but we're hoping, for great things to continue to roll out over time. So,
amazing. Thank you so much for your perspective, and George, and then we'll pivot to some audience questions.
What would you like me to weigh in on specifically? Everybody's covered it already. Yeah.
Fair. I guess, one thing that I would say, and, feel free to offer my opinion here, and you can correct me if you think that I'm wrong, George, but, when I first joined the Church Lab, I was able to immediately step into this community of people that were as excited about biology and biotech and translating science to make an impact on patients as I was. And I actually very distinctly remember when I was rotating here, and I had actually known Gleb prior to joining the Church Lab, but I remember the first day I came in and I saw him, had connected with him in a separate context and didn't really realize he was part of the lab. And we just saw each other and we were like, hey, and we struck up a conversation. And then I think a few days later, obviously I told him all about, the research that I was interested in doing. And he, gave me the early manifold pitch, and, we were just like really connecting on that. And I remember a few days later, he just emailed me an introduction or a potential introduction. He was like, hey, these guys, they're investors in this area, they're, usually write these check sizes. Like, I think they might be interested, as a good lead for you if you're potentially thinking about spinning something out. And I remember all the conversations I had with folks, every project behind that project, they had already started thinking about how to pitch it as a company, and sort of what are the key questions that investors are going to ask, and what are people going to worry about, and how to do the science in the right way to address those concerns. So, I think I really benefited from stepping into that environment and just being immersed in it. And I feel like what we're trying to do with Nucleate in a way is really bring that sort of knowledge and that environment in sort of an open access way, across boundaries to the rest of the folks out there that have those interests. There are obviously labs like George's lab and a number of other labs across the world where, this is sort of a common occurrence and these communities exist. And I think, the vision and the goal that I'm really excited about for the organization is to just extend that aspect of community and access and education to the rest of the world.
Yeah, well, that I agree with everything you said, and I'm pleased that it might have been at least partially inspired by an environment that had self-assembled and under my watch. I think that some of the people coming out of my group maybe needed to be introduced to partners and mentors a little less than your average, but I still think every one of them seems to have benefited from Nucleate, and is very grateful. But I think it's especially valuable if you're far away from such resources, which I would say 99.9% of the labs are. So thank you.
Yes,
Really?
and in the spirit of gratitude, I want to thank all of the panelists for answering my pre-prepared questions. We're going to turn it over imminently to the audience questions, which you guys have all put into the question and answer Q&A section of this webinar interface that we find ourselves in. And right before I do that, I just wanted to add a little bit of context. We've all been talking about Nucleate and the Activator. So once again, just to note that it is Nucleate is a nonprofit led by academic trainees and designed for academic trainees with a number of free and open programs. The Activator program is this program that we've all been talking about on this panel, which enables academic trainees to become leaders in their own startups by a number of means. And the deadline to apply to that program is going to be this Friday, October 21st. And you can go to apply.nucleate.xyz to apply for this free program. So that said, I'm going to go turn it back to George Church here again with one of the first audience questions, and that is, do Doctors Church and Bathe have any advice on whether PhD students who want to develop a startup should move to a postdoc? And that's asked by Connor. Thanks, Connor. So George, what do you think?
Well, I already mentioned two of my students, Dennis Grisham and Yuri Laserson, who started startups while they were like second-year graduate students. So obviously starting it once you have a PhD is not necessarily premature. I think doing a postdoc, it's a personal decision. It's whether you want to put off, if you have a passionate vision that you developed as a graduate student, why put it off? On the other hand, if you feel like something even more amazing is going to come about, either new project or maturing their other project, to avoid getting diluted out because it's a half-baked when you just finish your PhD. I think there are a number of factors that come in. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but definitely consider the possibility of, I mean, some people dropped out of Harvard to start their company, Harvard undergraduate, not much less PhD, Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, for example. So it's case by case.
Definitely case by case. And so the next case, we're going to turn it over to Mark. So the question is, should PhD students who want to start a company go do a postdoc?
Yeah. So, I think, as George already said, I think if you're ready to go, you're ready to go with your company. But on the other hand, there can also be benefits of doing a postdoc. For example, building your CV. You want to be a real technical expert, in the area that you're launching into, and you feel like another paper or two or experience in lab academically might really help you move a little further in that direction. So I'd say, there's nothing wrong with that, unless it's such an urgent idea that in a year or two, you're going to already be way behind the curve. But the sense of urgency, I think, is typically less than one thinks, because companies take time, and technologies and commercialization takes time, and so there can be benefit, I think, to doing the postdoc. And then I think earlier on, just to sort of dovetail with the other question around other universities outside of Harvard and MIT, I think there's tremendous opportunity outside of Harvard and MIT as well, nationwide, for students and postdocs to found companies, particularly because, by founding the company and working on it through a program like Nucleate as a student or postdoc, you have the opportunity to decide on the path of the company. And so, you don't necessarily need to go straight to an investor or an investment fund that's going to have very specific timed milestones that they may impose on you, but rather you might, like Jason Kelly, who founded Ginkgo Bioworks, go to an SBIR from the NSF, for example, or NIH, get non-dilutive grant type funding, and there are many other pathways of generating funding as well. So that's a great opportunity, and I think that's one that's been around for decades, but I think it's certainly proliferated a lot in the past few years due to these types of programs, Nucleate and others, that are facilitating crossing the chasm, if you will, from academia to commercial enterprise for students and postdocs. So a little bit of an add-on to the postdoc question.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Great perspective.
Is it me?
It's you all.
Awesome. Great. So I actually just want to answer a very brief logistical question that someone asked in the chat first, which is, can they join or apply to the Activator as a team, like with a technical co-founder? The answer is yes. And then I want to pivot to another question, and I'm actually going to pair two questions together, and then I'd love to hear Gleb, Tim, and Floris's response to this. So the first question is, does Nucleate accept applications in which the idea concept is novel, but there needs to still be about a year of laboratory work? So the answer to that is yes, and I'm sure that in a second, Gleb, Floris, and Tim can tell you a little bit about where they were at in the science when they applied to Nucleate and sort of how they were able to progress it after the program and potentially as well as during the program. And then the other question that I want to combine with that was, someone had asked, can you talk a little bit more about how the CEO role evolves over time, starting in the lab and growing into a small biotech? So I'd love to sort of maybe start with Tim, and then we'll go to Gleb and Floris.
That's good, because I'm the earliest in that transition. So, okay, so when to spin out in terms of the readiness of the science, I think if you only have a year worth of science left to do, that means that you're far more ready than most companies are to spin out, I think. I think there's usually a lot more science than that needs to be done. And George mentioned that there's ways of getting non-dilutive funding to help you do that science if you think you're not ready for venture money. But yeah, to me, I think the time to spin out is whenever you think that you have an idea that could make a real company, you could build a real company around. And if there's more science to do, there are investors that are there to support you, and there's grants there to support you. And if you're ready to go to consumers right away, then obviously you can just go do that. But yeah, I think a year worth of research is that would be great. I wish I had a year ahead of me. And then in terms of the transition to the CEO role, which I have at Wild Microbes, I think to me, I felt ready to take that role. I felt like I'd been in a leadership position within labs, and I felt pretty good about my perspective on the industry. And I think that my biased take here is that I think the scientist should be the CEO. It depends on the personality, but I think if the personality meshes with that role, if you feel like you can inhabit that role comfortably, I think you should do it. Because I think there's no one else that knows the science as well as you do if you're founding the company based on your technology. And there's no one else that can build the team and build the science and build the product and go to customers and sell customers as well as you can. And ultimately, as a CEO, you're responsible for all aspects of the business. So yeah, to me, if I would say my advice would be, if you're comfortable doing it, you should step up and do it.
Great, thank you. And I just also want to briefly elaborate on the sort of timeline as it relates to the Activator. Unlike a sort of traditional accelerator model, which requires you to incorporate an entity and then sort of give up some equity, leave your academic position to participate, the Activator is completely free. We don't require you to start a venture or an entity, nor do we take any equity or fees. So most of the people that actually participate in the program are still in the lab and do have about a year or two, on their graduation horizon, or about a year or two left in the lab. And they come out of the program with sort of the roadmap that they need to sort of understand how to use that time most productively if the goal is to start a company on the end of it. So just flipping over to Gleb now to hear his perspective.
Sure. So towards the question of timing to spinning out, I think if you're looking at having about a year-ish left in the lab, and that's sort of your plan anyway, that's kind of the perfect amount of time. Because now you can start getting out, iterating on your story, getting feedback from a sort of market product perspective, and actually allowing that to influence the science or the technology development that you're doing internally. I think that much more heavily applies if what you're building is a new technology or platform. Maybe a little bit less if you just have a very specific therapeutic hypothesis you've been working on. But for us, that was quite key. And so during Nucleate, kind of the idea was coming to focus in response to what we were hearing externally. And then towards your second question, Oliver, about that CEO transition, I think, before we started, we hadn't really defined, who's CEO, who's CSO. We just, thought of ourselves as founders and let's get this company going and then do what makes most sense for the company. As we got close to fundraising, it became pretty clear that having a very clear, CEO that was responsible for fundraising and, in my case, operations, and then having a really clear CSO in charge of the scientific roadmap, and sort of together being overlapping on the product was just very simple for folks to understand. And Pierce and I, we sort of organically arrived at that sort of split. Then there's other functions you have to do. So I kind of think of it beyond just the role of the CEO, but the role of the founding team or the role of the early leadership team. So there's all this other surface area you have to cover, like business development and setting up processes, and you just need to cover all these areas. And one key thing that doesn't change, or that shouldn't change, is your involvement, at least one of the founders, deep involvement in hiring. So setting up that process and then sort of being out there recruiting folks, the first scientists, the first research associates, and then eventually the more senior folks, once you get to that point, that remains your responsibility. And ultimately your responsibility is to set the culture of doing that for, forever. So that's continues to be important.
Thank you for that. And Floris?
All right. Try not to repeat what you guys said. I think for Nucleate, I would answer 2 questions. First of all, will I be in academia in the next round of the Nucleate program? So that's the first question you have to answer. If you're still be in academia, then that is the question that brings you to the second question. And that is, am I currently at a point where my technology pulls me into a very specific market direction, so a very specific direction of where I want to go? And do I need to validate that? And if that answer is yes, then it makes sense to directly go and do the Nucleate program right now. If the answer is no, I will be in academia next year, and I currently don't have any just specific direction where I want to go, maybe continue with the technology a bit more so that you get more data. But that depends on you. And then from the CEO perspective, honestly, I don't give too much on just the CEO role at the earliest stages of a company, because in the end, it's about the team, as Gleb said, that does things. Of course, the CEO is the face of the company, but the role, what you're actually doing, could be completely different. For me, I'm a very CSO, CEO type, so I'm very much involved in the science, more focused on the science part. But therefore, I have an MBA person who is the business person who's doing a lot of the operational stuff, accounting, setting up taxes, doing all that part that I currently don't need to do. But normally there are other teams where then the CEO does all taxes, accounting, HR, payroll, and is less involved in the science because they have a CTO. So I think that calling us CEOs, there is no real definition for that in the first 2 years of a startup. It's about building the right team that can get all the different positions, and then we have to give us names.
Yeah, and so we've sort of talked a lot about having these almost egalitarian teams in the early phases of a startup and promoting a sense of harmony and lack of conflicts. But now I want to completely flip that on its head, and now we're going to talk about conflicts of interest. And so this is a question, I believe, from Samuel in the audience. Speaking as a professor, what is a major conflict of interest that an academic PI should worry about when starting a company inside the university? So that's the way the question was phrased. Sorry, Samuel, I want to try to modify this a little bit, and I want to sort of broaden this and say, when you're starting to create an academic company, right? Often there's this pressure to publish because you need to publish to graduate. There are all kinds of reasons why you may want to publish, both as an advisor and as a student. And so my question to sort of the entire panel, but I'll start with George, is how do you balance sort of the need to publish and get your work out into the public, and therefore make disclosures of technically sensitive details, with the need to have certain aspects of that be confidential and proprietary? And that is almost the inherent conflict of being an academic founder.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I've said this frequently to my students, postdocs, and company colleagues, is that, and usually they already have a feeling similar, which is that a good paper, a high-profile paper, gives you better quality applicants for employees, gets you better relationship with investors and with potential customers. It also gets you typically free public relations, which is quite positive. So I think it's not really that big a conflict, but your question is about, is there proprietary information there? I think it has been maybe most journals have acknowledged that there can be proprietary components. You're typically, the goal is to allow reproducible science. So the proprietary components have to be made available in some way. There are even cases where the result is interesting enough that they take they say, well, this is an exception. In the same sense that there are all kinds of astronomical events that are not reproducible in a classic sense. It's tolerated. You need to be careful, and it's a very similar thing with patents. Patents, it has to be enabling disclosure. You can't hide part of it, and so that's a decision whether you want to go patent or trade secret. But I would say mostly these days people go the patent route.
Right. And then in the spirit of, I guess, enabling disclosures, I'm going to ask Mark to make an enabling disclosure on this same question. How do you think about navigating the academic obligations as a professor, needing to publish, needing to share with the public the work that you've done, with keeping certain aspects of that work proprietary to facilitate startup formation?
Yeah. So just to be clear, here at MIT, we have a conflicts office or manager that really helps work closely with students and postdocs as well as faculty during the conception phase of a company. And students and postdocs don't start companies or get involved with them here until they leave MIT. So there's a clear kind of hopping point. Now, that's not to say that, of course, MIT, faculty and students and postdocs are thinking about companies all the time about what to do, because that is, an express mission of the Institute, is to impact society through technology and commercialization. So what you're asking is, how do things go from, bench to bedside in the sort of medical lingo? I think the focus is always on the scientific results, first of all, and publishing, because that's what we're funded by the organizations that we do research for and with, to do. So that's really the focus, including for Flores when she was here. She worked on, a follow-on research project that helped immensely contribute to ongoing science in lab. And then, the typical route is to of course, patent if it's novel at MIT with the TLO, the Technology Licensing Office, that helps navigate that process, which is, quite involved, and do that, of course, before you publicly disclose in a paper or presentation, so that you don't violate public disclosure on your patent. So those are stepwise sort of the ways to do it. But I think, like George said, having a high profile, great paper is a fantastic way of having, as I said earlier, also a great mark on your CV, giving you credibility as a technical founder, and then of course attracting also interest from the public as well as investors to help see that technology go from the lab out into society through commercialization. So I don't think there are really conflicts per se. I think one has to just be very aware of sort of the hat that you're wearing while you're doing research versus the hat that you're wearing while you're trying to start a company. They're two different hats, and you don't want to like wear the same hat at the same time, or there's two different hats at the same time, but rather be very express and clear about which one you're wearing and when, and communicate that very transparently to everyone around. So.
And I was wearing the hat of question asker, but I'm going to pass the hat over to Oliver.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, so first of all, before we wrap up here, I just want to thank, all of our panelists, everyone in the audience for their time and participation and all the words of wisdom that we've gathered today. I think it's really impactful for folks to hear this discussion and to really talk about, a lot of the things that, really are challenging in the early stages of starting your company. So I would like to pose the last question today to the three former academic trainees, current founders on the call. And I would ask that you answer just briefly in a few sentences, but for anyone out there, in the world who is a current academic trainee doing a PhD or a postdoc working on some really exciting technology, and maybe is sort of considering whether or not they should pursue that technology in the context of a startup, sort of what general advice would you give them? And maybe we'll start with Flores.
Customer research. That's the two words that are important. But what does that mean? Because especially for a biotech company, we don't know who our customers are. I think there are two buckets of customers for a biotech company. One is, where would my technology end up? And then find the experts in industry, reach out on LinkedIn, reach out through any channels you can reach out, ask your PI to get you in contact with someone, and then talk to them and ask them, does it actually make sense that the science that I find so cool can actually be like any use outside of academia? And then honestly, your second customer is the investor, especially if you have a biotech therapeutics based startup that takes years and millions of dollars. Your investor is a potential customer. So reach out to these people early and figure out, not as a pitch, I want money. Everyone says, don't ask for money, ask for advice, but figure out what are they interested in currently, where do they see the market go? And see them as one bucket of your customers, and that's important.
Great advice, Flores. Thank you. Tim?
Yeah, so I would say, Flores is right on. Just to the last question, very briefly, I wanted to say that George's advice of publishing, he's always had a very open kind of attitude and open environment in his lab, and that's one of the ways that I changed the most in going through that environment was a real appreciation of openness. And I think it's never a bad idea to share an idea, whether it's publishing or telling people. And I think it's when you form a company, it's going to be about how you execute on that idea that matters. But yeah, as to advice for founders, I'd say, it's really boring, but yeah, customer interviews, just talk to people over and over and over again that you want to sell to, and make sure that the thing you do is going to make a difference in their companies. Yeah, that's a painful gauntlet to go through, but that's you have to do it.
Thank you, Tim. Gleb?
I will echo the customer interview parts. That's really important. But maybe something a little bit different to think about is sort of timing of when to spin out, and actually even the question of should you start a company or should you pursue your what you're working on in an academic environment. And the advice I like to give here is sort of think about the environment that maximizes both the sort of the right pace for what you're doing as well as the impact of what you want to do. That might be in academia for the long term. It might be in a company sooner. And that transition can happen where you might have access to special resources or just have a very high risk thing or very, kind of deep, unknown biological questions, it can make a lot of sense to stay longer in academia there. And alternatively, you might be facing sort of an engineering problem, something that just takes a lot of really good engineers, scientists. When you leave into industry, you do, in my opinion, have a little more optionality of building the team. You can compensate a little more competitively, a lot more competitively, and of course you have a different approach. You set milestones a little more aggressively, and so really think about where's the best place for you to be to for the technology or the impact that you want to create, and when that line, if there has to be a line, when it should be.
Great. Thank you.
And
if I can just offer one thought of my own on this topic, because I think we see this a lot with folks that come through, the Activator program or in the Nucleate community. Generally, folks in the lab are so concerned with sort of the science and often are intimidated by sort of the prospect of entrepreneurship, right? I mean, we look at these people that run these companies and we often think, oh, how could that be me, or how could I, learn to do something like that? How does one even learn, entrepreneurship? And for a long time, I think people didn't really believe that entrepreneurship could actually be taught. But we now know that sort of it can be, and there are ways to sort of explore that path for yourself without, necessarily needing to make that plunge and sort of leave your academic position and incorporate the company. So I would definitely say, to anyone out there who's struggling with that question, is this the right time? Is this the right technology? If it's something that is an interest of yours and you would like to gain sort of knowledge in that area, I would just highly encourage you to sort of take the plunge and sort of do things in an educational sense that can sort of get you closer to sort of answering that question, right? I mean, the Activator, I think, is a great opportunity. There are many other things out there as well, even shorter programs with less time commitment, like Frequency or the Engines Blueprint program. And there's also an amazing amount of variety of materials online as well. So I would just say, education is really the key, and it can often be scary, when you're at the beginning of something, to think about how you're going to be able to pull it off. But there are resources out there and folks that can help you. So I just want to sort of end on that note, and I'll pass it back to Michael.
Yeah, and in the spirit of folks that can help you, I think we're also grateful for the folks on this very panel that were so helpful with their thoughts and thoughtfulness. And we're also grateful to you, the audience. So thank you so much for posing these great questions to our panelists. We hope that you got something out of it on how to start a company with your academic advisor. We're grateful for you. And definitely don't be a stranger. This is a community that we're building around empowering biotech leaders around the world. So thanks so much and have a wonderful evening. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Thank you.